At exactly midnight on June 25, 1975, the printing presses across India went dark, and the country's prominent opposition leaders were dragged from their beds and locked in jail cells. The suspension of the world's largest democracy was a high-level bureaucratic maneuver, executed with a single signature from the President of India. This diagram shows the architecture of the Indian Constitution, highlighting the clause that made it possible. Buried inside Article 352 was a provision allowing the president to declare an emergency for an internal disturbance, a vague phrase lacking strict legal definition. Democracy gave way as a politician located a specific vulnerability in the nation's foundational code and triggered the exploit. The person who triggered that vulnerability was Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Early in her career, political insiders dismissed her as a dumb doll, someone they could easily manipulate. Instead, she consolidated power and became an iron-fisted ruler. By 1975, her grip was slipping. The country was suffering from severe inflation and rampant corruption. Millions of frustrated citizens joined massive protests, led by the prominent political figure Jayaprakash Narayan, demanding a total overhaul of the system. The breaking point arrived in June. The Allahabad High Court found Gandhi guilty of using state machinery for her election campaign. Her election was cancelled. By law, she was required to step down. She refused to relinquish office. Instead, she cited the widespread protests as an internal disturbance and advised the president to declare a national emergency. Cornered by the justice system, she used the law to eliminate the rules of the game entirely. The immediate consequence was absolute censorship. Electricity to uncooperative newspaper presses was severed. Editors who protested did so by printing entirely blank pages, while hundreds of journalists who defied the new guidelines were arrested. Looking at this legal flowchart, you can see exactly how the government bypassed the justice system. By weaponizing a law called the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, or MISA, the state created a direct, unquestioned path to prison. They could lock anyone up simply by claiming they might commit a crime in the future. Every major opposition leader, trade unionist, and vocal critic was rounded up under MISA. There were no trials, no appeals, and no release dates. The state had successfully used legal ambiguity to classify political disagreement as a criminal act. With the opposition locked away, power consolidated further. Indira's son, Sanjay Gandhi, held no elected office and had no official title, yet he assumed extra-constitutional authority as the de facto ruler of India. He aggressively pushed a nationwide forced sterilization campaign to curb population growth. District officials were assigned hard quotas. Police raided villages, dragging young men into operating camps against their will. In a matter of months, 6.2 million people were forcibly sterilized. Simultaneously, Sanjay directed a massive urban renewal program in Delhi. Without any legal notice, bulldozers aggressively leveled slums and shops, forcibly displacing over 700,000 residents from their homes. Stripped of democratic friction and judicial oversight, citizens were downgraded from participating voters to subjects of an unregulated authority. Grave, because the entire opposition was sitting in jail, Indira Gandhi had the total parliamentary majority required to rewrite the law itself. The government passed the 42nd Amendment, a document so sprawling it is still referred to as the mini-constitution. Among its many sweeping changes, the amendment directly stripped the courts of their power to review the prime minister's policies or challenge her elections. The ruling party had hard-coded their exploit directly into the nation's constitution. Then, in January 1977, Indira Gandhi made a surprising decision. She abruptly lifted the emergency, released the political prisoners, and called for fresh elections, likely believing she could win a fair vote and legitimize her absolute rule. The public immediately voted her out of power. She even lost her own local parliamentary seat in Raebareli. A coalition of opposition leaders formed the Janata Party, and Morarji Desai took the oath as prime minister, establishing India's first-ever non-Congress government. Despite nearly 2 years of systemic oppression, the democratic reflex of the Indian populace survived. The newly elected government had one immediate mission. They had to patch the constitutional vulnerabilities that allowed the emergency to happen in the first place. They introduced the 43rd and 44th Amendments. As you can see in this system blueprint, the 44th Amendment deployed a critical security update, immediately restoring the Supreme Court's authority to check the actions of the government. They closed the Article 352 loophole. The vague excuse of an internal disturbance was completely struck from the text, replaced by a strict requirement for an armed rebellion. And to prevent a prime minister from acting alone, a declaration now required the written, unanimous consent of the entire cabinet. Finally, they installed a permanent failsafe. They ensured that the fundamental rights to life and personal liberty can never be suspended, even during a legitimate, legally declared emergency. The 1975 emergency was a catastrophic democratic failure, but it forced the creation of a constitutional firewall that continues to protect Indian citizens today.